Dr. Arthur Frank, thank you so much for being here with me today to talk about your experiences at Mount Sinai. And today is May 11th, 2022. Can you just tell me a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and kind of what school was like for you as a young person?
I had the privilege of growing up in New York City, so I'm a city kid. The public school system had a age limit, but I was raised by a single mom, so she sent me back to school a year early. I ended up spending virtually all of my education till I graduated high school at two schools. One was a small private school in our neighborhood that only went to fourth grade, and then starting in fifth grade went to a boys' prep school in New York City on scholarship there for many, many years and graduated from there. Went to the University of Buffalo, studied anthropology as an undergraduate, and also had started working in research laboratories. I grew up quite close to Columbia University, the medical center, and started working in a research lab there this summer between my junior and senior year, and then worked after school my senior year in the research lab. When I was in college, I ended up working at the Roswell Park Memorial Institute, a cancer research center. And while it's pretty common now for medical students or medical student aspirants to shadow doctors and publish papers, 50 some odd years ago, I published my first paper while I was still a college student, first author paper, and then applied to medical school.
What interested you about anthropology, and how did you make that kind of pivot to medicine?
Well, first of all, it goes back to when I was about 8 years old and my mom got me a book on dinosaurs. You know, it's a big popular thing with kids these days, but even then it was popular. So I got interested in dinosaurs and soon realized that dinosaurs and humans did not cohabitate the earth at the same time. And actually had been introduced to the field of anthropology while I was in high school through strangely enough, an English teacher who had also studied anthropology. So I went off to college and decided I was going to do anthropology. Most of my studies were in physical anthropology, so that was biologic anthropology. I took some advanced biology courses. So I was always interested in science. It was actually the summer between my freshman and sophomore years that I spent my first summer working at Roswell Park. I was working with a cancer surgeon, but we were doing some basic laboratory work on the spread of cancer, metastatic disease. And all of a sudden, one day, I just said to myself, I want to go to medical school. I had been considering a number of careers. I was thinking about a professional career in anthropology, but realized that medicine is where I wanted to go. My plan B, should I not have gotten into medical school, which was and always has been a bit of a crapshoot. You're never sure if you're going to get in or not. I had a choice, I figured, of either following anthropology and getting a doctoral degree there, or my second choice after that probably would have been to become a professional chef. I've actually been the cook at home for the 40 plus years we've been married and cooked for the family all these years. So fortunately, I can still do that, but ended up absolutely enjoying my career in medicine.
Tell me a bit about kind of the emphasis on education. And was there an expectation that you would go to college?
I was a pretty bright kid in high school and stuff. So the expectation was always there on my part, too, of going to college. I was never forced into studying any particular field, nor was there an expectation of career choice. All the choices were my own. I was actually the first one in the family from a German Jewish family. You know, so education was always valued to be born in this country. Both my sets of parents had come over from Germany. My father had been killed while my mother was pregnant with me, which is how I ended up with a single mom raising me. So it was just she and I. And I think the expectation was that I become educated, but the choice of what to study was clearly for me to choose. I worked hard. That was always a requirement. I mean, I have certain natural gifts. There's some fields I was strong in: biology. I did well in anthropology. Math was never my strong suit, for example. I always struggled with that. I've always been a believer in working hard. And, you know, I've always told my own kids and students, having been an academic my whole career and having advised students, find something you love, be the best you can be at it, and try to leave the world a slightly better place than you found it. And those are the rules that I try to live by, and have done that for myself as well.
That's so great. So you kind of make this decision to pursue medicine instead of anthropology. How do you decide upon Mount Sinai?
That was fairly easy. I've always been somebody that has been intrigued by new things. This was the first year of a brand new medical school. I did get into some other schools. I didn't get into some other schools, but having been a New Yorker, it meant I knew something about Mount Sinai. It had a wonderful reputation as a hospital. I could be back home in the city, not necessarily living back home with my mom, which I had done obviously before I went off to college. But the idea of a brand new school and being a bit of a pioneer was a big part of my choosing Mount Sinai. I figured the excitement of a new place would outweigh whatever difficulties there might have been. And it turned out my whole career has been similarly going to new things. I joined Mount Sinai in the first class in 1968. Late that year in December, I met Dr. Irving Selikoff, who was head of the Environmental Sciences Laboratory and was already by then an expert, worldwide expert in the area of asbestos and asbestos-related disease. He invited the whole first-year class to his office for lunch one day. He always liked big offices, so he had room for many of us. And, most of us went for a so-called free lunch, though there isn't any. We had to sit for an hour through a lecture, but we had some really nice deli sandwiches that day. I remember that. But I was intrigued by his work. It combined a lot of things that I was interested in. It had to do with cancer research, which is an area I'd been working in for at least 5 years at that point. It had its cultural phenomena because he was working with working people. These were insulators and other groups that he was studying. So having understood something from anthropology about different cultures, and there's something about a workplace culture that makes it different from other cultures, that turned out to be a useful way of looking at the world, given what happened to me in my later career. And I went up to him and said, come January, we have elective time starting. I'd like to do some work with you. So he took me on and we started visiting. And by January, as we were meeting, as they say in The Godfather, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, I'll be happy to sponsor you as well for a PhD degree. And so I ended up becoming the first Mount Sinai MD PhD student.
Wow.
I graduated, I think, as the first student with both an MD and a PhD. And he took me under his wing. He was one of my two great mentors. And so he took me on to work with him during the summer and did something very unusual. He paid for me to travel around the country to speak to people that he recognized as leaders in the field of occupational medicine, which is where I was going to be headed as a career, and literally paid to have me go visit with them, interview them, find out about the field, how they got into it. And while I was a medical student, at some points I had 4 part-time jobs. I was an IV technician in the morning. I worked in the blood bank as somebody taking pints of blood out of people there. I worked in the biochemistry lab as their weekend technician. And Selikoff had me reviewing death certificates for one of his research papers. So I had 4 part-time jobs helping to put myself through medical school. Finally got to the point when I was a second-year student, I remember saying, I'm not reading anything anymore. So no matter how late I studied, and again, I had far brighter classmates, than I was. In medical school, you're dealing with sort of the top of a pyramid. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there were clearly, brighter students than myself. I probably ended up at the bottom of the top third of the class. I mean, I did okay. I finally said, I don't care what time I finish studying. I'm going to read for 20 minutes or a half hour. So at 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd still read something just
for pleasure.
For pleasure.
Bring me back to 1968. You're starting medical school. You're in your early 20s. Tell me about the physical space. Tell me about the other students, your first impressions of just being in the medical school building.
Sure. Well, the medical school building was an old bus garage. The original building, now called the Cummings Building, it was monies donated by the fellow that ran Sara Lee Bakery and other ventures. I forget his first name, but Mr. Cummings donated a lot of money. They took an old bus garage, gutted the inside, built 3 floors plus a mezzanine, and clad the outside of the building in white marble. So under the white marble is the old brick of the New York City bus garage. There were two multidisciplinary laboratories. This was a fairly new concept. So we had our permanent desk, and they basically brought everything to us at our desks. We had our own microscopes and slide sets. One of the two rooms had a crypt for the dissections. We actually were put into the second year lab because there was no first year class or second year class besides us. The first year lab had the dissection area, so we moved to that one for class. The mezzanine was an area for the students. It had a large classroom at one end, but it had a mezzanine area. I think we had a ping pong table and a piano. But our class, this was the 1960s. It was a time of activism. There were only 36 of us. We met every Monday over lunch to talk about how things were going at the school. And we rotated the chair of the lunch meeting alphabetically through the class. And we also alphabetically moved it through the class as to who would order lunch. We'd all turn our lunch orders in. They'd call the local deli or the pizza place or whatever and get lunch. So we were a very democratically run, sort of semi-socialistic group, but we hung together. And in fact, the very first week there, one of the two highlights of the first week go like this. The very first lecture at the medical school was an honor given to Dr. Hans Popper, who was the first acting dean, was a world-famous pathologist. The second lecture, and he was a Viennese-trained pathologist with a very thick German accent. He was followed by Dr. Katsayanis of Greek extraction, who was head of the biochemistry department, did world-class research on insulin. And he was followed by Dr. Tibor Barca, who was a Hungarian by birth, who was head of the anatomy department and a very well-known histopathologist. I remember very distinctly after our 9, 10, and 11 o'clock lectures, one of my classmates, sort of just standing in the hallway, speaking to no one in particular, said, "I knew medical school would be tough, but I thought I'd at least be able to understand the professors." 3 different accents and 3 different lectures. Fortunately, I'd grown up in a household as the firstborn here in this country to accents, so it didn't particularly bother me. So I did fine with the accents, but I remember that. The other thing was that was Monday. Friday, we had already organized ourselves as a class, and we asked if the grading system could be changed from an ABC system to a pass-fail system. This was the time of cutthroat medical schools where the deans would start at the beginning of the year, say, look to your right, look to your left. One of the 3 of you will not be here at the end of medical school. And Sinai didn't have that philosophy. They were very forward-looking in many ways. For one thing, they had a tri-legged tripod stool. The clinical sciences, the basic sciences, but also community sciences and community medicine. And it had one of the strongest departments of community medicine. In fact, that term community medicine had been started at the University of Kentucky by a Dr. Kurt Duschel, my other great mentor, who after having started that department at a rural medical school, came to Mount Sinai to start a department of community medicine at Mount Sinai. And the environmental sciences laboratory was actually within that department. So I had the joy of having 2 great mentors, one who educated me scientifically. Dr. Selikoff had his own issues as to how he treated people. Dr. Duschel, on the other hand, couldn't have treated people any better and trained me knowing that I was headed for an academic career, which Dr. Selikoff had figured out, which is why he offered me the chance for a PhD, that he took me under his wing and over the years literally trained me in those kinds of administrative things that one needed to know about to become an academic and eventually a department head. The other story is that we had asked for a change in the grading system. And the dean of the medical school, again, I had a fair amount of interaction with him, especially for a first and second year medical student, Dr. George James, probably more than any of my classmates for a variety of reasons, invited us all to his office, again, another large office, for coffee and Danish on Friday morning before class. And again, if this was the 1960s, student uprisings, and word got around the hospital that the students had stormed the dean's office, which was not true. He had invited us in. And he gave us the famous cookie jar speech. one of the things we asked for was we wanted to be on all the committees that the medical school had. As students, we wanted our piece of it. And he said, I have no problem with that. You can be on every committee except appointments and promotions, which is a faculty committee that deals with faculty. But otherwise, you can be on all the other committees. And somebody said, well, why can't we be on that committee too? And he gave us the cookie jar speech. He said, I'm laying out for you 10 cookie jars. And I'm telling you, you can have 9. From 9 of them, you can take cookies. You just can't have any from this one. And you should be satisfied with, what I'm giving you. And I've remembered that as the famous cookie jar speech. So we were very collegial. The school was collegial. Not everybody. The head of the, I don't know what his exact title was. He was the chief of cardiothoracic surgery, and he was supposed to be the student faculty liaison person. And he had no real sense of us and was, as a surgeon sometimes can be a little domineering. We were complaining about some things that first week, and he had met with us, and we had asked for, again, a pass-fail system. And he looked at this collection of 36 fairly activist students. I mean, I'd been on the picket lines for the war, and my classmates had, I had a bunch of classmates that went to the Woodstock Festival. He looked at us, and his opening line was, "Now, kiddies." That didn't go over too well. That's when we asked to go see the dean.
Got it. When you stormed his office for Danishes? Yeah.
When we stormed the office for Danishes, we didn't have enough money to buy our own donuts,
Let me ask, you shared about a couple of mentors that it seemed like really shaped kind of your time at Mount Sinai. But I'm wondering if you have a story or a memory of a kind of an experience, an interaction that helped shape and guide kind of where you ended up in medicine.
Oh, I have so many of those, but I think one that comes to mind in our second, because it's what kind of doctor one becomes. And I don't mean what specialty, but how you interact with patients. As we started learning to do physical diagnosis in our second year, and we would go up on the floors and be introduced to patients and learn which end of the stethoscope actually went in our ear, that kind of thing. I forget who it was, but the very wise preceptor that my little group had basically looked at me and looked at all of us and said, when you become physicians, he said, try to remember this. He said, treat every patient as if it was your grandmother. And that's been a guiding principle for me. Treat everybody with respect, with understanding, with an appreciation of who they are and what you represent to them. And, one of the things you learn very quickly in your career is that the white coat gives you all kinds of privileges and respect that may or may not be deserved. One has to be aware of what it means to be in a position of power. And I have never forgotten that rule. By the time I was a third-year student, my reputation was such that people knew that I was probably headed for an academic career. So I was sitting I was doing an OBGYN rotation. I was in the locker room with the chief of OBGYN at the time. And Dr. Gusberg and I were both changing to go into the operating room. And he was looking at me and knew who I was. I mean, there were only, again, 36 of us. So we added 12, 48 of us in the clinical years. But they knew who we were. They'd interacted with us enough. And he looked at me and he said, young man, he said, if you're interested in academics, he said, what you should want to be is your goal should be to become a full professor and not to become a department head. And he was the department head speaking to me. He says, you get almost as much respect and you have a lot fewer headaches. I didn't take the advice because I ended up being a department head at 3 universities for over 30 years. And I know what he means about the headaches. But that was a piece of advice shared, as was another one by another clinician. And it's these little pearls of wisdom that come out in these short statements. And it was, again, somebody who knew that I was headed for academics. And they shared with me, he says, it's important that you become an expert in something. It doesn't matter what that something is. Once you are an expert in something, they think you know everything. He was actually in charge of the gout clinic. I mean, Sinai was fascinating in that we had 110 specialty clinics. I mean, we had clinics for diseases that most places, people wouldn't see in their career. We had a myasthenia gravis clinic. We had a sarcoid clinic. We had all kinds of a gout clinic, pregnancy clinic for diabetic mothers. I mean, Sinai was and continues to be an absolutely, remarkable place.
It sounds like what you're saying too is the message you received early on was to not forget the humanity of the people that you're working with as well.
Yeah. Right. And we also had a class that fostered that. It was called an Introduction to Medicine. And it was actually run by the community medicine department. Out of the first few months, it was every, I think, Friday morning, if I remember correctly, or Thursday morning. It was some morning for about a 3-hour session. 5 of the first 10 sessions were all on the subject of diabetes, but from different perspectives. A type 1 diabetic, a young person, type 2 diabetes, pregnancy and diabetes. And I remember they brought in an African-American gentleman who was a taxi driver to tell his story. He had developed type 2 diabetes, and he'd have to stop his cab in a out-of-the-way place. He was going to the bathroom all the time. I remember the 2 issues that he remarked was I had to go to the bathroom all the time. That's the high blood sugars make you have urinary frequency. And he was also saying that he was having trouble with relations with his wife, impotency being another part of diabetes. And they bring in these real people to sit there in front of us and educate us as, there's a transition where you're going from a non-physician, maybe a bright, college graduate, but you don't know medicine. And here's the insights into what medicine is really about. They brought in 2 doctors. One was a surgeon, one was, I think, an internist. Do you tell people with terminal diseases that they've got a terminal disease? One said, oh, you never tell them, it just gets them worried and anxious. And the other one says, you always tell them. They got to do their planning. They brought Alan Guttmacher in, he was head of OBGYN before Dr. Gusberg of the Guttmacher Institute. He'd come to Sinai from Johns Hopkins. He gave us a whole session, and this was before Roe v. Wade, talking to us about abortion. Here's the man who, lived it and made his life around taking appropriate health care of women and their health care needs, and their pregnancy needs and their non-pregnancy needs, who was sitting there in front of us talking to us about this issue. So it was a remarkable time. And then, we all got integrated because many of us joined committees. I was on the library committee. I was on the animal care committee. Others were on the admissions committee and all kinds of other committees. Another one of your questions is, you said, please complete the sentence. Because of Mount Sinai, and in my case, I've had a wonderful career that has taken me around the world. Literally, I've been to over 30 countries. I've done research in much of Asia and in Mongolia and China and lectured in Thailand. I've been to India maybe 30 times. I've been to Sri Lanka. I've been to China 20 times over the years. I've got friends literally all over the world. Most of Europe. I'm still actively doing work down in South America. I lectured in Brazil last week, unfortunately by Zoom instead of going down there. And Sinai has given me this. And so this is where I've drawn on my anthropology training, because one of the things that people ask me when I go off to a new country, and I've been to some unusual ones, like 7 trips to Mongolia, Brunei, Malaysia. They say to me, well, when you go to these countries, what are your expectations? And I say, I go without expectations. I go to see what is there. I remember my first dinner in India, 2001. I'd arrived about 2 a.m. the night before at my hotel. First dinner that night was my host, who was head of the occupational medicine unit at a medical school in India, one of the 2 or 3 best medical schools out of 400 in India. And the dean came to join us for dinner. And we're in the restaurant at the hotel. And I'm sitting there eating some of the Indian papadums and eating little green chilies that they have in a bowl on the desk. And the dean looks at me and he says, my gosh, he says, you're eating like an Indian. And I looked at him and I said, well, where am I? Yeah. You find out what the culture is and you become part of it, which is why I've been invited back, which is why I've been made a visiting professor in Beijing, in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, at the Maulana Azad Medical College in India. I've had visiting professorships during my career.
And what do you think it is about Mount Sinai that prepared you for the career that you've had?
Because the people that I worked with were culturally sensitive. Dr. Duschel, for example, had worked on the Navajo Indian Reservation and used to talk about some of those experiences. And Selikoff, because of his work in the area of asbestos, knew people all over the world who had done that. And so I had met people at various meetings when they came to Mount Sinai or to international meetings that he would sponsor from all over the world. And he saw to it that we would travel, and he took us to international meetings. I just had a funny experience about a month and a half ago. In 1971, I'm a third-year medical student. I'm a wet behind the ears medical student, and I go see Dr. James, who's the dean of the school and president at Mount Sinai, and I told him that I was headed over to Europe. It was my first trip out of the country, maybe other than Canada. And I knew that a big donor of the school was Walter Annenberg. He and his sisters had donated $1 million each, eight of them, $8 million. That's why we have the Annenberg building at the center of the Mount Sinai complex. And so I told him I was going to be in England, and I said, you think it would be appropriate for me to drop in on Ambassador Annenberg and have him meet one of the students from the school that he's been supporting? So he put me in touch with Gus Levy, who was the managing partner at Goldman Sachs. The address at Mount Sinai, if you know it, is One Gus Levy Place. He was chair of the board of trustees at Mount Sinai. He was a good friend of Walter Annenberg's. He made the connection. I ended up seeing Walter Annenberg in London. I visited with him. I came back. It was at the end of the summer. And about a week later, in those days, whenever there was an investiture of a new professorship, the students would get invited. It was usually on a Friday afternoon. It was free drinks and shrimp. So we'd make dinner out of it and have a free drink. And so I remember going to the investiture of whichever professor it was that first week back at school. And Jack, I'm blocking on his last name, the head of fundraising, comes over to me and he says, I understand you met with Walter Annenberg recently. I said, yes. He says, how'd the meeting go? I says, well, he seemed pretty pleased. I brought him some photographs of what was then the construction of the Annenberg building. It was just steel girders, but he was much taken with it and asked if he could keep some of them and show them to his wife. And I said, I thought it went pretty well. He spent a half hour or so with me. And he says, yeah, it seems like it went pretty well because right after you were there, he and one of his sisters called up and are donating another $1 million each towards the school. And I said, do I get a finder's fee? No.
Yeah.
And then I said, well, how about you waive my tuition this year? He says, no. But on that same trip, while I was in England, Dr. Selikoff had introduced me to Sir Richard Dahl, who was the Regius Professor of Medicine and another asbestos researcher at Oxford. And so I went to Oxford. I met with Sir Richard, visited in his office. He got rid of me fairly quickly by taking me to the pub in the hospital and buying me a beer and then saying goodbye. You know, we talked a bit about the work I was already doing with Selikoff about asbestos and such. This is what I mean about Selikoff sending me to see people. And here I am. So about 6 weeks ago, I'm in Oxford again because my youngest son has gotten his MBA there and he's living in Oxford. And I end up giving a lecture on asbestos to the pulmonary people at Oxford University. So 2 years later, I've closed the circle from being a wet behind the ears third-year medical student to giving a lecture after 50 years of working in the area of research on asbestos.
What would you tell a new medical student who's trying to apply and decide where to go to medical school? What wisdom would you share?
Again, it goes back to, find something you love, find a field that you love, work hard and be the best you can be at it. Always take good care of your patients. Try and remember the moral duties of a physician. I mean, we get such privileges. I mean, we can touch people in places that nobody else, you'd go to jail for touching people there. We ask questions that would be so inappropriate, except in a medical context, we get to do it. So never forget the privileges you have as a physician. Unfortunately, so many of them come out of school with such huge debt that they end up picking high-priced specialties. I wish medical school was if you were good enough to get in, that would be cheaper, that Sinai could maybe go to the NYU model where they could raise the money to not have people pay tuition. So you could pick the field you love. I mean, clearly I went into preventive medicine, public health, occupational medicine, not the most lucrative field, but boy, has it been wonderful. And I also trained as an internist. And I spent 2 years at the NIH, the Public Health Service, a commission that I held for 37 years. And people said, why did you keep the commission? It was obviously in the reserves. I did some active duty again in the 90s for a little bit with a government agency. But try not to let money sort of drive you through medicine. Try to find something you like, because so many doctors now are unhappy in medicine. The whole idea of medicine, of course, it'll never happen for a whole variety of reasons, but we are a profession that ought to be looking to put ourselves out of business. I think we should have more focus on prevention, which we don't have enough of. And look what's happening here. The Congress won't put money into the public health system. Quote, COVID's over, so we don't need a public health system anymore. And people predicted this was going to happen. What would I change at Mount Sinai? What would I hope would change there is that the institution would be less interested in money. I know that for a while they were having, severe financial crises and were losing money every year, but now they're well into the black. But money is much the driving force there, and it's not something that I sort of like to see. I wish that Sinai would go back more to its community roots, and I wish it had a more robust alumni organization. It's a small group of us. I wish they would put more time and effort into that.
Anything else that you want to make sure to capture, particularly when you think about somebody new and interested in medicine listening to this?
I'd probably want to educate them that some schools are better for some things. If they think they want an academic career, a place like Sinai would be a good place to go because it's a true academic medical center. If they were interested in a frontline primary care career, there are probably better places to go or different places to go. They need to understand what they're getting themselves into. I already knew 50 years ago that medicine was going to be run more and more by insurance companies. And I wanted no part of that. I didn't want to have a situation where somebody was dictating to me how long I could spend with a patient. I mean, I trained as an internist. I then trained in occupational medicine. That's what I chose to do. I've spent up to 2 hours with a patient getting to the bottom of what their problem was. I can't imagine any situation in a private practice where you wouldn't be frowned upon for taking more than 20, 30 minutes with any given patient. At the other end, I've had the experience in India. Wonderful, brilliant physicians that I've seen at this really top flight medical school. They see a patient every 2 to 3 minutes. They'll see 120 patients in a 3-hour clinic. There's no time for human interaction. What's wrong? Here's your script. And I looked at them one day. These have got to be good friends. And I said, well, what happens if you get the diagnosis wrong? Oh, well, they'll come back. I thought to myself, yeah, or they'll be dead. And you should never stop valuing each human life. The fact that Sinai has a Jewish history, I think maybe had something to do with my going there too. And it had a set of Jewish values that I haven't been around enough to know if they're still there. I don't get the sense of it nearly as much from what interactions I have. But the old concept that, saving one life is like saving the world, and each patient should be that one life you're trying to save. And in those days, most of the doctors were Jewish. I don't know if that's still the case now. It's probably not. And so this set of Jewish values and the fact that some of them were very open about the fact that they had to go to a place like Sinai to train because being Jewish, the other institutions in New York wouldn't take them. Mount Sinai, we started as the Jews Hospital. That was the name of it. And it was during the Civil War riots when they would bring people literally from the street into the hospital for care when people got injured, that they realized that they ought to become non-sectarian and changed the name to the Mount Sinai Hospital and took in non-Jews as well.
So my last question, and I'm going to let you go, I promise, which is what was this experience like for you?
In all my years, I'd never had a sabbatical, having been an academic, because I was always a department head of small departments, and I couldn't take the time away. Well, finally, I gave up being department head here at Drexel back around 2013, 14, whatever. And I finally had time for a sabbatical. And what did I do with it? It's what I put in for, and they allowed me to do it, and I'm still working on it, is I'm writing my medical memoir, which obviously focuses on Sinai, what it did for me, to me, and then the experiences I've had all over the world with all kinds of vignettes. And it's autobiographical, but it's also, full of these stories and these thoughts that I've got about what it means to be a doctor. So this is sort of up my alley. And I wish you great success with this project. I'm glad we're finally doing something after 50 years at Sinai to sort of memorialize some of this.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time and sharing your stories and insights with me. And I'm excited for the larger Sinai community to be able to hear it as well.
Well, thank you, Becca.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you doing it.